The bus slowed as it rolled past the cracked sidewalks of Orchard Park, place where five boys once believed music could lift them out of everything they were born into. The windows shook with the winter wind. The streets looked the same, but the boys who returned were not the same anymore. They had just finished a national tour. Their song was on every radio station in America. Crowds screamed their names, people called them stars. Yet as the bus doors opened, something in the air felt heavier than the applause they had left behind. Ralph Tresvant remembered the way his breath caught when an envelope was placed in his hand. A simple white envelope, a symbol of everything they had hoped for. Inside, the number stared back at him. $1.87. What do you do when the dream you trusted begins to cut into you like a blade you never saw coming? The truth he would one day reveal did not come from anger. It came from a wound that had never closed. And at 57, he finally decided to speak. Because some storms do not pass. They wait for you. Before anyone knew their names, the boys of Orchard Park shared something far more powerful than fame. They shared a neighborhood where cracked pavement held the weight of too many broken promises, and where music was not entertainment but escape. The stairwells echoed with rhythms made from fists on metal railings. Laughter carried through corridors that sometimes felt too narrow to hold their dreams. In those shadows, Ralph Tresvant learned to use his voice not as decoration, but as survival. He remembered how cold the winter shores were, how their breath turned white as they walked to rehearsals in borrowed coats. They did not have much, but they had each other. The sound they created together felt bigger than their circumstances, bigger than the doubts adults carried when they looked at boys who came from the projects. Every harmony was a hope. Every rehearsal was a promise they made silently to themselves. Maurice Starr entered their world like a spotlight, cutting through a dark room. He spoke in terms that felt grown, using words like opportunity and protection. To mothers who worked long hours and counted every dollar a contract that claimed to safeguard their sons sounded like the kindness they had waited for. The boys trusted him because children often trust the first adult who says they believe in them. They did not yet understand how business turns belief into leverage. When they signed those contracts, they thought they were stepping into a life where their talent mattered more than their poverty. The papers were filled with terms no teenager could interpret. What they saw was a door. What waited behind it was a trap already set in ink. Their rise was fast. Candy Girl pushed them into living rooms across America. Suddenly, the same boys who used to rehearse under flickering hallway lights were singing on stages lined with thousands of faces. Hotel rooms, tour buses, bright cameras, endless sound checks. They grew up in front of audiences who never knew what they carried quietly behind their smiles. But beneath the glow, there was an uneasiness they could not name. Payments were always delayed. The answers adults gave them never felt solid. They were surrounded by success, yet they still lived with the same empty refrigerators and overdue bills they had known all their lives. Ralph saw the confusion in the eyes of his friends. He felt it too, like a knot tightening slowly. Their mothers believed a trust fund existed, something the courts were supposed to protect, something meant to ensure that even if the boys were too young to understand business, their future would not be stolen. But hope can be fragile in the wrong hands, and promises can disappear without sound. The truth was not handed to them. It waited, it watched, and it broke them only after they had already worked hard enough to think they were finally safe. Success arrived the way storms sometimes do, sudden and without mercy. One day they were boys squeezing into small practice rooms, and the next they were rushing through airports chased by fans who screamed their names as if those names belonged to legends. The world had decided that New Edition mattered, and for a while the boys believed it too. Their voices blended with a precision that felt effortless, but the effort behind it was enormous. Long nights in studios, rehearsals that stretched into dawn, interviews where they learned to smile even when their bodies were too tired to sit upright. Yet the attention wrapped around them like warm light. It felt good to be seen. It felt even better to be heard. Ralph Tresvant became the steady center of the group without ever asking for the role. His voice carried the softness and strength that defined their sound. Producers leaned toward him. Fans reached for him. Responsibility formed around him quietly the way frost forms on glass overnight. He felt it, but he rarely spoke of it. Leading was not something he chose. It was something the industry placed on him like a crown that shimmered but weighed heavily. As the tours grew larger, so did the distance between the boys who once ran through Orchard Park chasing the same dream. Fame changes people in ways they often cannot see. Bobby Brown began pushing against boundaries, craving a spotlight that was never big enough. He wanted more time on stage, more freedom, more recognition. In his mind, he had earned it. In the minds of others, he was becoming unpredictable. Yet the most painful fracture did not come from Bobby. It came from a decision made behind closed doors, far from the eyes of the member it would wound the most. When Ralph arrived in Minneapolis to work on the Heartbreak album, he expected a familiar room, familiar faces, familiar roles. Instead, he walked into a studio where Johnny Gill was already settled as the newest member of New Edition. No one had called him, no one had explained anything. The silence around the decision was louder than any argument could have been. Ralph stood there, understanding in an instant that choices had been made about his future without him even being in the room. He wondered how long the conversations had gone on. He wondered who had agreed, and he wondered why no one thought he deserved the courtesy of knowing. Producers Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis witnessed the tension immediately. They felt the stiffness in the air, the unspoken questions, the careful distance the original members kept from one another. Johnny was talented, undeniably so, but talent does not erase the history of men who grew up together, survived poverty together, and carried the weight of exploitation together. Johnny did not share that past. He could never carry its scars the same way. Yet the album that emerged from that period became one of their greatest successes. That irony stayed with Ralph. Greatness built on quiet fractures. Victory shadowed by betrayal. Even at their peak, the ground beneath them was already shifting. The signs were there long before anyone said the words out loud. Small things at first. Missed calls, missed rehearsals. A look in Bobby Brown's eyes that felt different from the boy Ralph had grown up with. A restlessness that no spotlight could soothe. It was the kind of change that happened slowly, then suddenly all at once. By the mid-'80s, the pressure around them had turned into something heavier. Bobby began slipping into rooms late, his movements unsteady, his thoughts scattered. The others tried to pretend it was exhaustion, the natural price of fame. But Ralph saw what was underneath. He watched his friend reach for things that pulled him further away each time. It was drugs first, then chaos, then a version of Bobby that none of them recognized. Rehearsals became unpredictable. Performances became fragile. Bobby would stretch his solo moments far beyond the set list, forcing the rest of the group to stand still beneath the hot stage lights, while he tried to outrun something only he could feel. Ralph covered for him in interviews, his voice steady even when his heart was not. The breaking point came during the Home Again tour in 1996. The reunion was supposed to heal old wounds, but instead it tore open new ones. Tension followed them from city to city. Crews whispered backstage. Security stayed close. Everyone waited for the next crack to appear. And then it did. It was bad. On a night meant to celebrate their return, Bobby pushed past every boundary they had agreed upon. His solo stretched endlessly. The music slipped into noise. Ronnie DeVoe stepped forward, trying to pull him back into the moment, back into the group, back into something like control. What happened next was not music. Two men who had grown up together collided in front of thousands of quiet, stunned faces. A fight broke out on the stage. Fists, shouts, confusion. A brotherhood unraveling beneath bright lights and an audience that did not know whether to scream or pray. Before anyone could breathe, the sound tore through the venue. Gunshots, one echo, then another, sharp enough to freeze the air. Nobody was hit, but that did not matter. The word gun alone was enough to send bodies running for exits and hearts pounding against ribs. Ralph had never moved so fast. The noise felt like the end of something they had been trying desperately to save. The chaos did not come from fans. It came from the entourages that shadowed them. Groups of men who argued backstage about loyalty, about territory, about pride. Men who wore the names of the band members like badges and carried their own battles into the tour. Violence followed them like a shadow they could not escape. In the aftermath, the silence between the members became deeper than the wounds. They had dreamed of singing together forever. Yet in that moment, forever felt like a word that no longer belonged to them. Across America, people saw New Edition as a success story. 5 boys from the projects rising into stardom, singing harmonies that felt like sunlight cutting through heavy clouds. But behind the applause was a truth that millions of older Black Americans recognized instantly. The system was never designed for boys like them. It was designed to use them. What happened to New Edition was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern that had shaped the American music industry for generations. Contracts filled with promises but carved with loopholes. Trust funds that vanished without explanation. Recoupable expenses that turned every victory into deeper debt. To the public, the boys looked wealthy. To the labels, they looked profitable. But in their own homes, refrigerators were still empty, and parents still worked double shifts to survive. Fans across the country would later say they felt betrayed when the truth came out. They had celebrated the tours, the sold-out arenas, the platinum records. They never imagined that the same children who stood on stage in matching outfits were returning to neighborhoods where lights were sometimes shut off. For many Black families, this was not just a music story. It was a reflection of how America treats talent, especially when that talent comes from communities society refuses to fully see. The violence that followed the group on the Home Again tour only deepened the public reckoning. Newspapers called it chaos. Commentators called it proof that fame had broken them. But older fans, the ones who had lived through the crack era, the housing project raids, and the endless cycle of survival, knew it was more complicated. You cannot take boys from instability, place them in an industry built on exploitation, and expect peace to follow them. Around the world, audiences were shocked by the revelations of guns backstage and friends turning into enemies. But in America, particularly in Black communities, people understood. They knew how easy it was for young men to carry the weight of poverty, trauma, success, and expectation all at once. They knew that the music industry had a long history of extracting brilliance from Black artists while giving them little protection in return. New Edition's story became a case study in how success can look golden from the outside while cracking from within. And for many fans, it was not disappointment they felt. It was recognition. In the years that followed, the noise around New Edition rose and fell like a tide that refused to settle. Arguments cooled, then resurfaced. Friendships healed, then fractured again. It became a rhythm of its own, a cycle as familiar as the songs they once sang in perfect unison. And through it all, Ralph Tresvant carried the quiet weight of someone who had spent a lifetime trying to hold a family together while watching it pull itself apart. When he stood beside Bobby Brown in 2024, sharing a stage for a song that had defined an era, the moment felt both fragile and inevitable. Every little step was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it felt like a memory unfolding in real time and a reminder of who they had been before the contracts, the lawyers, the broken promises, and the gunshots. Bobby leaned into him, not as a star, but as a man who had survived himself. Ralph understood. He had stopped expecting changes that would never come. What he found instead was acceptance. Some people cannot be remade. Some wounds cannot be fully repaired. And some bonds remain even after they have been tested beyond recognition. The truth he had spent decades avoiding was simple. They were never the brotherhood fans believed them to be. They were boys pushed into a system they did not understand, shaped by hands that valued profit over protection. They were survivors of success that arrived too early and responsibility that arrived too late. Yet their legacy did not lie in their conflicts. It lived in the music that carried entire generations through childhood heartbreak and growing up Black in America. It lived in the harmonies that felt like home even when the members no longer did. It lived in the audiences who still sang their lyrics softly on long drives and quiet nights. Some stories end without closure. But dignity does not need applause. To anyone who has ever stood alone while holding together something that was falling apart, we see you. To anyone who has carried burdens silently because the world only wanted your voice, not your pain, your story matters too. If this journey reminded you of someone you once admired or grew up with, share their name below. Your memories keep these stories alive. And as always, thank you for staying until the end.